So this is our last section of Unit 6A, Human Nutrition in Soils, and this is Part 4, Soil Problems and their Solutions. So soil problems really start with soil erosion, the wearing away of soil from the land. And this is caused really by water and wind. And it's a huge problem because it causes a loss in the soil fertility, and these nutrients are eroded, which means we have to add fertilizers into this soil now to create more plants and fruits, vegetables. The other issue with this is then we actually have less nutrients in the food that is grown in this soil. So this is accelerated by poor soil management practices, of which we have a huge amount of soil management practices that are very bad in the US. So if you look at this shows you moderate soil erosion is in yellow. Okay, so Great Plains in the US, moderate soil issues. Okay, most of Asia, upper part of the Middle East, you've got lots of soil erosion. Same thing over here, Australia. Then your severe is your green, which makes no sense to me that next is the green color. So then this is the kind of as you're going towards the west coast in the US. And then your red is your very severe. So you have your very severe right now, west coast, huge drought going on. Okay. Down here you've got South Africa, you've got these smaller areas where it's very severe. So soil is eroding faster than it's forming on more than 1/3 of the world's cropland, which is very bad. And this is just a general, it tells you where there's some serious concern, where there's some concern, and then where it's stable or non-vegetative. If you're looking at here, you've got Greenland, non-vegetative. You've got most of Russia and Siberia, non-vegetative. The same thing up here. Okay, and then you have stable areas like, most of Florida and here, the Sahara Desert, non-vegetative. Some of these issues we have are salinization and waterlogging. Salinization is where the salinity goes up, so the salt level goes up. So your irrigation water contains small amounts of dissolved salts because usually your irrigation water is coming from it being pumped up from the ground. So once you're getting the irrigation water onto your fields, you have evaporation, and your salts that are naturally occurring in that groundwater don't evaporate. They leave the salts behind. Salt builds up in soil, overwatering, and what you get is salinization. The soil becomes too salty for things to grow. Waterlogging is when you have precipitation and irrigation water that percolates downward, and you have a water table that actually ends up rising, and you can see here, and it ends up actually, excuse me, it actually ends up drowning the roots of the plant. Okay, you're overwatering, too much rain. So soil salinization is an issue usually in arid and semi-arid areas because the water that falls quickly is evaporated and it leaves behind these salts. The salt concentrations get really toxic, and then what people try to do is flush the salt off of their fields with more water, and sometimes that does work and sometimes it doesn't work. Desertification is basically you had once fertile area and then it becomes a desert. So you go from this agricultural productive land and then you get this non-productive desert. Think back to when we were talking about how a rainforest rains and how you have this little microcosm going on with the transpiration from the leaves going up and it's hitting the undersides of the other leaves and then it's raining down, and then if we cut that rainforest down, you lose this internal water cycle. And a lot of times when you cut down rainforests, you can plant some things, but you're not going to plant another rainforest. And what happens is you get a lot of rainforest that goes from the most productive biome in the world to this desert biome, which is the least productive biome in the world. Africa and Asia have the largest areas of desertification. They have lots of drought, poor soil nutrients to begin with. So the example that we use for desertification is the American Dust Bowl, which was from 1930 to 1937. There was severe drought. And it was the northern part of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, really in the heartland of the U.S. What they did was they took the Great Plains with these natural grasses, with these huge roots that just held this amazing soil in place. and they got rid of all of the native vegetation and they planted their crops. There was drought, no natural vegetation, so those roots could hold your soil in place. And what happened was you had this mass dying of all of these plants, no roots to hold it in place, and what you got was the Dust Bowl. So the soil got so dry and it just blew out. And you can see in this picture down here, you can see this was a wagon wheel, and it looks like you're at the beach. It's just, this is all soil that has gotten crusty and blown away. So winds blew the soil as far east as New York City and DC. Farmers went bankrupt. It was this crazy, crazy thing that happened. Okay? And what ended up happening was the Civilian Conservation Corps came in and they started doing soil reclamation practices in that area. We're going to talk about those in a bit. So the Soil Conservation Act of 1935, smack right in the middle of the Dust Bowl, said we're going to form the Natural Resources Conservation Service. We need to assess the soil damage. We need to develop policies to improve soil. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again. In 1985, the Food Security Act was passed, the Farm Bill, and this required one of the very small components of this very big farm bill, huge, massive bill. It requires farmers with highly erodible soil to change their farming practices. Said, hey, you're doing this, it's not sustainable, you need to change. And this sounds like it's something that's fabulous, but also some of these things aren't really enforced. Okay? The Conservation Reserve Program is something that's really awesome underneath the Farm Bill, and it actually pays farmers to stop farming highly erodible land. Because let's face it, no one's going to do anything if it doesn't benefit them. Soil conservation practices. These are ways that we can conserve our soil, ways that we can keep our soil to be nutrient rich and not blowing away. Okay, so conservation tillage is basically you've taken your harvest from the previous year, which you can see this seems to be some old dead stuff. And what they've done is they've just planted in between it. So instead of tilling your soil and getting your plants, your old plants, into the soil to decompose, what you do is you just cut the stuff, you leave it on top, and that suppresses weed growth. And then what happens is you plant new stuff on top of that, and what you end up getting is you get soil erosion that does not occur. Okay? Conservation tillage also includes no-till agriculture, which is what I just described. Crop rotation is another big thing. So you plant a series of different crops in the same field over a period of years. So I obviously forgot to change the picture over here, but basically if you have this one plot, one year you would plant corn, the next year you would plant soybeans to get nutrients into the soil, the next year maybe you're going to plant some squash, then the fourth year you're going to plant something else, and maybe the fifth year you're going to go back to corn, which takes a lot of nutrients out of the soil. This lessens your pest and your insect disease. I get stem borers in my zucchini every single year, and I don't know how to stop them without using toxic pesticides. So what I do is I move my zucchini around the garden every single year so that hopefully the little buggers that are in the ground don't travel as well to the new location of zucchini, and I get a higher yield. It really hasn't worked for me, but it works for lots of other things. So the next one is contour plowing, and this is plowing around a hill or following the natural contour of the land instead of going up and down. So you can see here is the top of your hill, here's your bottom of your hill. Okay? If I'm going to plant my rows of crops like this, what's going to happen is I'm just going to get lots of water eroding down the slope. This way what happens is when you're plowing to the contours, what you get is you get water that gets trapped here before it can run down, water that gets trapped here before it can run down, and so on and so forth. So this decreases your soil erosion. Very similar, you have strip cropping, which you also saw on the last slide. Okay, so this is also an example here of contour plowing, but also they're doing it in strips. So here's one crop, here's your other crop. This is corn, this is, let's say, soybeans. Okay, so you have these alternating strips. So if this area here is infested with soybean worms, it has to get through this whole layer of corn to also infect these soybeans. Okay, so it's not a straight up monoculture, it's a polyculture. They are planted together. And what you end up getting is higher yields. And then if this area is infected, maybe you just lose this section of the crop. Terracing is amazing, and it's creating terraces on steep slopes to prevent erosion. This was used a lot in ancient civilizations. The Mayans use this, and in Peru, the Aztecs use this. Still used in Vietnam, you'll see the rice paddies like this, and that's most likely what these are. These are most likely rice paddies, and they flood them because rice grows in marshes or watery areas. And this really, really changes the landscape, but in areas where it's virtually impossible to grow food because of this steep slope of the land, what you get is you get terraced fields. Agroforestry is another. You plant your trees in with your crops to improve your soil fertility. It reduces your soil erosion. It regulates your water. It provides habitat for natural enemies of crop pests. So what you're going to have is you're going to have the birds up in the trees that are going to eat the insects that are eating your crops. The leaf litter that falls regenerates the soil, and it also creates some shade. For some plants, they can't grow with blaring sun. What it does is it evaporates the water too quickly. It can burn their leaves. So in this case, they plant acacia trees and millet together, and that's your co-planting. Last but not least, we have soil reclamation. So there are a couple different steps. You want to stabilize the land to prevent further erosion, and then you want to restore the soil to the former fertility. The best way to do this is to plant shelter belts, and this is what happened in the Dust Bowl. What they did was they planted an insane amount of trees to basically cease the erosion. So there was all of this wind blowing through, and what they did was they planted trees. And what the trees did was they acted as a windbreak. And then they could start rehabilitating their fields and adding nutrients into their fields. And shelter belts have also been used in Africa with great success. Think back to Wangari Maathai. She planted thousands and millions of trees in the whole green belt movement in Kenya. That's it.